We are now going to have our final guest for this afternoon, Beth Radulski. Beth is Trobe University's first openly autistic autism researcher and is a PhD candidate in the Department of Social Inquiry and the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you.
Beth, I wanted to start by asking you how you balance your PhD research with your role as a neurodiversity project manager. So you're both staff and student.
Yes. I'm really fortunate because there's quite a bit of overlap between my PhD research and my role. So my research is really about, I'm a sociologist, so I'm interested in developing a theoretical model to understand the kind of systemic barriers to inclusion experienced by neurominorities in social, professional, and educational settings. So in my role, I get to take that theory and kind of translate it into a real impact in a practical setting in society, which is wonderful. So that really helps me balance everything.
Neurominorities, you've just introduced me to a new term there.
Sure.
Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of work in the neurodiversity sphere that talks about things like autism, ADHD, and so forth as minority neurotypes. So it's really reconceptualizing these identities as social identities and not as medical disorders necessarily. So neurominorities would refer to anyone who doesn't identify as neurotypical or typically developing.
Mm-hmm. And that is a self-identified process, or does there have to have been a diagnosis for you to belong to a neurominority?
That's an excellent question, and I think it's very nuanced. So typically within the community, it's accepted that if you self-identify as a neurominority, that's very valid. Mm-hmm. There are a number of reasons for that. For example, homosexuality was in the DSM up until the 70s, and we now know that self-identification is extremely valid in that regard. But in addition to that, there are lots of barriers to formal diagnosis, and these are very intersectional. So the community typically tends to accept self-identity as very valid.
So tell us a bit, Beth, about your PhD research then.
Sure. So my research focuses primarily on autistic masking and camouflaging. And so masking is the concealment of traits that would make you visibly not neurotypical. So that might be finger flapping. In my case, I've got a fidget toy. Differences in eye contact. Whereas camouflaging is what do you do to pass as neurotypical? How do you prevent being recognized as other? So you might make eye contact. You might change your tone of voice to sound very engaging. You might sit still instead of finger flapping. So it's kind of a multifaceted process.
And how are you actually going about conducting your research? Is it interview-based? Is it lab-based? I don't really know how people do science PhDs.
Yeah, so my PhD is sociology. So one of my methods is I've collected data from a survey on the social drivers of masking and camouflaging. And then I'm so fortunate. Trobe has been able to support my work through my role, and I've been able to actually do a couple of case studies on how we apply that theory in a practical setting and try to create some best practice principles for neurodiversity inclusion.
Mm. And why is it important to understand the social drivers of autistic masking and camouflaging?
So there are many reasons why it's really important. 3/4 of autistic people report masking and camouflaging, and many people from other neurominority groups report doing this too, and opting for non-disclosure. So there are a number of reasons we need to understand why that's happening. The first being if you aren't confident disclosing, if you're not feeling safe, that's going to lead to issues with accessing support. The other issue is that research is showing that masking and camouflaging are linked to quite significant mental health and well-being challenges. So anxiety, depression, identity loss, exhaustion, burnout, and unfortunately even suicidality. Autistic people have a suicide rate 7 times higher than average for the general population, and in the United States, the average life expectancy for autistic people is just 36 years old. And it's not, masking and camouflaging certainly don't explain that statistic entirely, but there's firm research showing that masking and camouflaging are linked to suicidality, and suicidality is one of the main factors driving that low life expectancy. So we need to understand how to fix this issue.
So we've been hearing from other researchers today a lot about real-world impacts and what the effect of research is going to be in terms of outcomes. What outcomes do you hope that your research might lead to?
So I suppose the key for me would be to create a more equitable society where we don't need to have masking and camouflaging to that extent. I mean, if you think historically of sort of similar context, there's lots of examples where there's been one standard of normal, right? And in neurodiversity, that's neurotypical. That's considered the only healthy, valid way to be. And then we have this spectrum of what we, once conceptualized and often still conceptualize as disorders. That type of hierarchy isn't unique to neurodiversity. We've seen that previously. And we've also seen that expectation that any group that doesn't fit the norm should assimilate, and that's the way to achieve participation and inclusion. We know that that's problematic. We've seen that with gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and now with neurodiversity. So if we want to create a more equitable society, we need to address societal, systemic, institutional, and cultural barriers to unmasking. We need to seek inclusion on the basis of validating neurominorities as full people and full human beings.
So I heard an expression the other day. It was neurotypical privilege.
Yes.
Can you explain neurotypical privilege? I
Sure.
assume that I have it and you don't. and how does it relate to masking and camouflaging?
So this is a sort of key component of my PhD, is theorizing and conceptualizing neurotypical privilege. And I think it's important to think of it as we think of other forms of privilege. It operates on social, cultural, and institutional levels. So what does that look like? If you teach a subject and you have an oral presentation, you might assess those presentations on the basis of, is that student standing still at the front of the room? Are they making eye contact with the audience? Is their tone of voice engaging? Those are all neurotypical traits. And those are traits that are valued and privileged in job interviews, promotion applications, even in society, engagement with police and in courtrooms. How do we conceptualize innocence? How do we conceptualize morality? If somebody's making eye contact with you, if they can look you in the eye, they're being honest. If they're fidgeting, we might think, oh, that's a sign that they have something to hide, that they're a bit anxious. And so neurotypical privilege manifests in those contexts by becoming the sort of only normalized expression of behavior.
How do you experience, in a Trobe setting, I'm just going to bring it down to not your whole life, but
Sure.
possibly in your Trobe setting, because we've been talking about inclusion today and staff well-being, and you're a staff member, student also. How do you experience your lack of neurotypical privilege in your day-to-day working life?
So I think, much of society is built in a way that it's aimed at benefiting neurotypical people. So I might see that, for example, in, colleagues not feeling safe to come out. As an undergraduate student, I thought it was so wonderful that La Trobe, one of the strategic visions at La Trobe was offering educational and employment accessibility to underrepresented groups. And I had such a diverse range of colleagues and peers, but I did not know a single person who was out as autistic or as a neurominority in any context. And that told me it wasn't safe to come out. And I spent years masking and camouflaging and trying to pass, to get by. I was worried, what's going to happen if I apply for honors? Are people going to think I'm capable? I was, at the time I didn't have citizenship, and I was nervous about, that can impact visa eligibility. So for me, I didn't get formally diagnosed until I already had citizenship. That may impact other international students. So I suppose it impacts me just being mindful that the community are facing these issues all the time, and we're up against those battles all the time. And I'm really grateful that La Trobe has made a commitment to taking a systemic approach to facilitating inclusion in that context.
It sounds like that level of vigilance would be exhausting.
Completely, and that's part of why the research shows that there's such negative well-being implications. And we're at a time when we have what researchers are referring to as a lost generation. So there are people who are 20, 30, 40, 50, and they don't know yet. And they're exhausted and they're burnt out, and we need to, be mindful that what we think autism looks like, what we think ADHD looks like, isn't the same for everyone. And so that, the exhaustion that those people are feeling, we need to be aware of that, and we need to try to make it safer so that they can connect with that aspect of their identity in a safe way.
Beth, I know another thing that you do here at the university and outside of the university is conduct neurodiversity training sessions, and I was fortunate enough to go to one of yours online a couple of years ago that the Humanities and Social Science School put on. It was wonderful. I'm wondering whether in those neurodiversity training sessions that you do people listen to what you're talking about and realise for the first time that they are not themselves neurotypical, and then come out as a result, or start to work towards coming out as a result of hearing you speak?
Yeah, so I think certainly it's a really safe space. We try to set it up so that people can learn the skills they need to have those open discussions and to understand neurodiversity in a way they've probably never thought of it before. And I think that allows people time to reflect. There's a blog posted online with one of our amazing academics, Ben Habib, in the politics department, and he speaks in that interview, in that blog, about how attending that session actually was the moment he recognized, this is what's going on with me, all of this sounds so familiar. So I think that those are really valuable sessions.
So is it possible that people who are neurodiverse don't actually even realise they're masking or camouflaging?
Absolutely. I think there's a very high instance of missed and or misdiagnosis leading up to finally being identified as a neurominority. So a lot of people, I certainly didn't know that I was masking and camouflaging until I came across the social movement on Twitter in 2018. I knew I was autistic by then, but I didn't know why I was so tired all the time and why I felt like I was trying 10 times harder than everyone else and I wasn't even coming close to keeping up. And people would go, well, everyone has bad days. Well, this is a bad decade. So I think, having that visibility and seeing other people who are not neurotypical and recognizing that that's not always going to look like the stereotypes you've been exposed to in TV or media can really help in that regard.
So a final question for you, Beth. If you are a staff member at the Trobe and you know that somebody in your team or in your department is neurodiverse, are there ways in which you could recommend that staff member can go about their daily life or their working life to make life easier for their neurodiverse colleagues so that they don't need to have to mask or camouflage or try so hard or be so exhausted?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a really nuanced answer needed, because I think, we need to approach this similarly to how we would approach if somebody were disclosing their gender identity or their sexuality. It's really important that we not take an approach that would out anybody. That, especially in a workplace, would be very confronting. So I think one of the things that you can do is take the time to sort of seek out a self-education in that area. Read about neurodiversity from the perspective of neurominorities. How can you offer support? What does cultural sensitivity look like? How do you support executive functioning? How can you facilitate unmasking? One of the things we did in social inquiry when I first started my PhD, I started bringing a basket of fidget toys to every staff meeting we had, because then everyone has the freedom to grab one. Nobody's going to feel othered if they can't sit still in that meeting. So just little things like that to model that this can be a safer place and we can work towards unmasking and making it a little bit safer.
That reminds me of, we had a person in my department who came out as trans a few years ago, and we did trans training for our department. And one of the things that many of us did was to all put our pronouns on our email signatures so that it wasn't such a standout thing for the trans person to have to do that. So I suppose you're saying that's the sort of thing that you can do to show your support without necessarily jumping up and down about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Beth, you mentioned that there's a lot of reading that people can do so that they can become educated themselves. Do you have a suggestion of where people could access some of that reading? Does the Olga Tennyson Centre have a website that has links, or where would people go if they want to follow up some of the things that you've been saying today?
Yeah, so we have a neurodiversity webpage at La Trobe, and every time we release new toolkits or blogs, we always update that. So there are several blogs now that talk about that. You can educate yourself on what support services are available to staff and students. If you identify as a neurominority, please consider joining our neurodiversity networks. We have a staff and student branch, and you can really access community in that way, which is, there's very strong research showing the protective effects of neurominority community in combating some of those well-being issues. And yeah, I think anything you can do to just focus on learning about neurodiversity from the perspective of neurominority people, that's really the key.
Well, Beth, thank you for coming along today, and I hope it hasn't been too exhausting for you to do this. We
didn't have to mask, so that's great.
And I actually want one of those. I can
have
see
an extra one. I can
fantastic.
provide one.
I'll get that from you afterwards. And good luck with the rest of your research, and thank you for all the work you're doing at the university.
Thank you so much.
So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you once again for joining us, and to all of our guest speakers for coming along today. I hope you've enjoyed listening from all of them. It's great to take this time to reflect on and to celebrate and to challenge some of our amazing programs and our research initiatives. So please join us again for the next In Conversation webinar, which will be on the 26th of July. It's going to be broadcast from the Albury-Wodonga campus with Mel Bish, the PVC regional, as the guest host on that occasion. Once again, if you have any feedback or suggestions for things you'd like to see, please complete the event survey, which you'll find in your On24 console by clicking onto the clipboard icon at the base of your screen. I hope you've enjoyed using that emoji function that we introduced today. Thank you all for your time. Have a great day. We'll see you again next time.